Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation will come to order. Yes, unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearings without objection, so that ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection, show that ordered. As a reminder, the members are to insert a document in the record, email us at documents@mail.house.gov. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. So today, the subcommittee will receive testimony from the Coast Guard's ice-breaking recapitalization efforts and the ability of the service to meet its ice-breaking and polar region responsibilities. I'd like to welcome our witness today, Vice Admiral Peter Gautier, Deputy Commander for Operations, Vice Admiral Thomas Allan, Deputy Commandant for Mission Support, and Heather MacLeod, Director of Justice and Homeland Security at the Government Accountability Office. Welcome, all of you. The United States has relied on the Coast Guard's persistent presence to demonstrate America's sovereignty in the Arctic since the United States acquired Alaska in 1867, and Antarctica since the Navy gave up the Antarctica icebreaking in 1966. The Arctic Coast Guard projects America's sovereignty in a region containing substantial resources that support a robust fishing industry, vast energy and mineral resources, and new routes to facilitate maritime commerce. Given this immense resources, it could come as no surprise that adversaries, including Russia and China, are working to assert themselves in the region, with Russia fielding 55 icebreakers and China deploying 4. At the same time, our nation has 2 operational icebreakers, one of which is dedicated to the service in the Antarctica mission in support of the National Science Foundation and is operating well past its intended service life. Not even John Rayfield, who's sitting beside me, as a subcommittee staff director, he wasn't even here when the Polar Star was commissioned in 1977. It's a long time.
Yep. I didn't miss it by much.
No. When was it?
I came in 1980.
Okay. To ensure continued polar ice-breaking capability, Coast Guard embarked on a polar security cutter program that was intended to deliver 3 new icebreakers beginning this year. That timeline and associated cost estimates were unrealistic, and the Coast Guard has yet to approve final design for the vessel and is unable to provide Congress with a new timeline or a new cost estimate for the first vessel. I'm optimistic that progress being made at the shipyard under the new owner and operator, but it is well past time that the Coast Guard provide us a plan to acquire the needed vessels to carry out its polar mission and execute it. So, Vice Admiral Gautier, nearly a year ago, this subcommittee examined the service Arctic missions. And during that time, you assured us that the Coast Guard would provide a plan on how the service will acquire its new fleet of icebreakers. Nearly a year has passed since that took place, and we don't have a plan. I expect you and Admiral Allan to clearly articulate how you will acquire these vessels and what resources you require to carry out the Coast Guard's polar mission. I also note that nearly 2 months ago, the bipartisan full committee and subcommittee leadership wrote Admiral Fagan requesting an update on the progress towards the PSC program milestones, which the Coast Guard has stated it would meet at the end of the year. While the Commandant replied to the letter earlier this week, she failed to provide any meaningful answers to the questions. Accordingly, we expect to visit with the Commandant in person after the Thanksgiving holiday to discuss Coast Guard's continued lack of action. Outside our polar regions, the Coast Guard provides critical ice-breaking capabilities to give commerce moving safely to our Great Lakes and at the United States Northeast ports. These missions are critical. It's important to have the service have necessary assets to carry out these missions. To our witnesses, thank you for participating today. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. Look forward to hearing your testimony. Now I recognize the chairman, the former chairman, now the ranking member of the committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, for calling this hearing on a topic of great importance, our nation's ice-breaking capabilities. We could have just as easily called this hearing iced out, but whether we're iced out or snowed in, we're stuck when it comes to ice-breaking capability. There's never been a more important time for the United States to maintain and expand its leadership in the Arctic. The region is rich in natural resources, including 90 billion barrels of undiscovered oil, 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas, and 1 trillion in rare earth minerals. Depending on who develops these resources and how, the Arctic could either challenge or accelerate the global transition to clean energy and transportation. In the last decade, we've all seen the rise of Arctic shipping routes. Over 400 ships transited the Northern Sea Route between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, a route previously impassable without an icebreaker. However, this activity has been dominated by Russian-flagged vessels, and both Russia and China have jockeyed for control of the region. In addition, the region hosts a $3 billion seafood industry, increasing tourism activity, and critical scientific research missions. So to do any of this work in the Arctic, the U.S. relies on the Coast Guard and its icebreakers to represent our interests in the region, including leadership roles on international bodies governing navigation, search and rescue, vessel safety, fisheries, and pollution. Icebreaking vessels are critical for the Coast Guard to effectively traverse the treacherous polar conditions, provide access for other stakeholders, and complete its missions in the Arctic. Our presence equals our sovereignty. However, decades of underinvestment have left the Coast Guard with only 2 ocean-going icebreakers, the medium icebreaker Healy and the heavy icebreaker Polar Star, which has already been extended far past its regular service life. In conjunction with polar icebreaking missions, the Coast Guard is charged with domestic icebreaking in 3 of its 9 districts. The Coast Guard also needs to expand its domestic icebreaking capability and infrastructure to support that mission. Plans to home port the polar security cutters in Seattle necessitate improvements to Base Seattle, as Base Seattle is a gateway for Arctic missions and supports critical maintenance. So all this is a contrast to Russia. Russia operates a fleet of 55 icebreakers, including 18 military icebreakers. China also operates a fleet of 2 medium and 2 heavy icebreakers, with more planned for construction. These nations have recognized the value of the Arctic and invested heavily in securing dominance in that region. So make no mistake, the U.S.'s growing fleet disadvantage presents an existential threat to our interests, our leadership, and our national security in the Arctic. That's why the Coast Guard is working to replace and expand its fleet of icebreakers, including an effort to acquire 3 heavy icebreakers through its Polar Security Cutter program. Originally, construction of the first cutter was scheduled to begin in 2022 with delivery in the mid-20s. Unfortunately, we have reached the mid-20s and the shipyard that won the contract has been sold. The design is only 60% complete, and the Coast Guard has not determined the delivery date or the final cost for the cutters. It's important to note that acquiring these vessels is no easy task. This is the first domestic construction of a heavy icebreaker in the U.S. in over 50 years, which only underscores the need for continued investment in U.S. shipyards and shipbuilding capabilities. Without a robust domestic shipbuilding industry, the Coast Guard will continue to face challenges acquiring any vessel. That's why it's critical that the U.S. recently, in fact yesterday, signed the ICE Pact, a collaboration between the U.S., Canada, and Finland to share information and technology and increasing the supply of icebreakers for our allies. Leveraging these international partnerships is crucial if the U.S. hopes to increase production, reduce costs, and rebuild its domestic shipbuilding industry. However, despite repeated requests from this committee, the Coast Guard has also not committed to a timeline or cost for construction of the first Polar Security Cutter. So today's hearing is an opportunity for this committee to receive more information about the Coast Guard's plan to complete construction. I also look forward to hearing how the Coast Guard intends to improve its polar security cutter program, including addressing the GAO's open recommendations. Finally, Congress has to recognize the Coast Guard will require additional resources in future years to complete construction and to expand its icebreaking fleet in the Arctic. While the Coast Guard has received appropriations for 2 vessels, that funding is now unlikely to cover construction for the first polar security cutter. So, Chairman Webster and Ranking Member Carbajal, thanks for holding this hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. So, Mr. Carbajal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, for calling today's hearing. The Coast Guard is the premier agency tasked with projecting sovereignty in the Arctic, which is a critically important mission. The region is slowly opening to all forms of commerce. The Arctic region has a $3 billion seafood industry vulnerable to overfishing and contains billions of dollars in natural resources. A U.S. presence is required to ensure safe and responsible development and the protection of resources and the environment. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard icebreaking mission is woefully under-resourced. The service's only 2 ocean-going icebreakers are well past their service life and often the victims of machinery casualties. This is simply unacceptable. I've had the privilege of seeing firsthand the capability of our Coast Guard icebreakers, and I understand the important service they provide to our nation. While recapitalization of the icebreaking fleet was identified as a priority almost 2 decades ago, we are still several years and over $1 billion away from the delivery of the first polar security cutter. As a result, the United States is missing out on the opportunity to enforce rules-based order and freedom of navigation in a geopolitically competitive arena in the Arctic. It's not simply about icebreaking. On the Great Lakes, the Coast Guard operates 9 icebreakers and only 1 is a heavy icebreaker. For the region itself, which is heavily dependent on commercial shipping, the need for more capable assets cannot be understated. 55% of the regional economy is dependent on key shipping channels, and 2/3 of domestic icebreaking operations happen on the Great Lakes. It is no secret that the United States has fallen behind the curve when it comes to the number of ice-capable ships in our arsenal and the time spent in the Arctic. This hearing today is focused on the need for the United States to invest in newer and better ships, more sophisticated technologies, and the capabilities to sustain the invaluable geostrategic presence in the region. While the Coast Guard has done as much as they can with only 2 ships, we need to give them the opportunity to do more, with more. I have major concern about the delayed PSC program and the amount of funding actually needed to just get 1 ship built. This is a far cry from the over 55 ships that are at our adversaries' disposal. From a national security perspective alone, this, again, is unacceptable. I want to be clear, the resources required to build, home port, and maintain polar security cutters are substantial. If Congress does not double the Coast Guard's budget in 2026, the service will either have to abandon the program, cease construction of offshore patrol cutters, or cut significant portions of its operations. The House passed an authorization bill earlier this year that begins to appropriately resource the Coast Guard, and I implore my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee to follow suit. The service has proven time and time again that even in the face of ship casualties and little to no resource support, they continue to sail onward. But how much can we keep asking of them? It's time for Congress to step up. I'm proud to advocate for America's Coast Guard and advocate for increased resources. I look forward to the testimony today and to hear about how Congress can better support the service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain the lighting system. Green's go, yellow is slow down, red stop. Pretty simple. I ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statement be included in the record. Without objection, show that ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearings remain open until such time as the witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. That objection, so that ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the committee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Vice Admiral Gautier, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Carbajal, distinguished members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity, especially during this particularly busy time in Congress, to share your Coast Guard's important work to advance maritime safety, security, and stewardship in our Arctic homeland and across the entire Arctic region. Your Coast Guard is in greater demand today than ever before, and upholding our proud 234-year history of serving the homeland and providing national security beyond our borders, including in the high latitudes, remains a top priority. Through routine presence, meaningful engagements, and deliberate actions that strengthen maritime governance, the Coast Guard provides a full suite of missions and services to Americans living in the U.S. Arctic and preserves our national interests and promotes peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative Arctic during a great time of regional change. With our unique combination of authorities as an armed force, a law enforcement and regulatory agency, and a humanitarian service, the Coast Guard is an ideal instrument for the nation to responsibly engage in this unique and challenging maritime environment. We're operating forward to address the safety and security of our Arctic residents and mariners who make their living there, home porting new cutters, investing in infrastructure and capabilities, prioritizing our operations in the region, and strengthening our international partnerships. And I'd just like to acknowledge a theme with your opening statements that the Arctic physical, operational, and geostrategic domains are changing rapidly, and that just drives increased demand for Coast Guard services. Russian and Chinese activities have dramatically increased in the U.S. Arctic. Between July and October, the Coast Guard monitored 3 Chinese research vessels operating above the U.S. extended continental shelf, as well as PRC Naval Surface Action Group and a separate Russian Federation Surface Action Group with our cutters and aircraft. And what's really notable, for the first time we witnessed the joint operation between the China Coast Guard and the Russian Border Guard in the Surface Action Group operating high in the Bering Sea, and that's a first. That just tells us that their Arctic cooperation is only expanding. The Coast Guard tracks these activities, and we continue to meet increasing presence with our presence along the U.S.-Russian maritime boundary line and within the U.S. EEZ. Through Operation Frontier Sentinel, we protect our sovereign interests, and we ensure that behaviors are in keeping with international laws and norms. As this type of activity increases, our Coast Guard will ensure the international rules-based order is maintained and the sovereignty of the U.S. is protected. I personally traveled to Alaska in early October, connecting with Coast Guard operational units and partners throughout the region. Local and indigenous groups are alarmed about Russia and Chinese activities in their backyard, the growing risks to the maritime environment from increased shipping, and the existential threat that they view from climate change. Coast Guard units in the region perform exceptionally under some of the most austere operating conditions on planet Earth, covering an EEZ greater than the lower 48 combined. However, our units are facing readiness challenges that threaten our ability to continue to meet the growing demand for our services across the Arctic. We're experiencing historic shortfalls in maintenance funding and a shrinking military industrial base that impacts material readiness of our assets. Our current shortfalls in personnel and material readiness create an imperative for action to adjust our force structure and posture and operate differently. Looking forward, we must continue to evolve how the Coast Guard operates, utilizing more capable assets and, with your support, increased resources to meet the critical demands that continue to grow both in breadth and in consequence and complexity. Coast Guard presence and leadership in the Arctic has never been more important than it is right now, and our service continues to be the right investment to protect the American people and the homeland. Thank you for the committee's enduring and strong support for America's Coast Guard, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Vice Admiral Allan. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Carvajal, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here to highlight the Coast Guard's continued investments and presence in Alaska, the U.S. Arctic, and the polar regions. The Coast Guard is working hard to meet growing mission needs in the polar regions. The service remains a unique instrument of national power, supporting national security and strategic objectives around the globe. As Deputy Commandant for Mission Support, I am focused on delivering solutions that equip our people with assets, tools, and support to project U.S. presence and mission capability in the high latitudes. The polar regions are experiencing an ever-increasing rate of change, requiring asset systems and infrastructure to enable Coast Guard operations in some of the harshest and most remote environments on the Earth. While the strong support of the subcommittee, the service is prioritizing significant acquisitions and modernization programs to meet national demands. I'm clear-eyed about the challenges that we face in recapitalizing the nation's fleet of polar icebreakers. Put simply, polar icebreakers are the foundation of the U.S. operational presence, I say that again, presence and influence in the polar regions. Our nation needs these multi-mission cutters to provide assured year-round access and the resulting security to our national interests in the high latitudes. The Coast Guard is diligently working with Bollinger, Mississippi Shipyard, building the Polar Security Cutter. And thanks to enormous efforts from many dedicated people, I am very pleased to report that we are on track to seek approval from the department to begin production by the end of this calendar year. The Coast Guard works with the U.S. Navy as part of an integrated program office to design and deliver at least 3 polar security cutters. This arrangement leverages each service's experience and expertise in large, complex vessel acquisitions. The Navy's support is critical as the United States seeks to construct its first heavy polar icebreaker in nearly 50 years at a time when the demand for new maritime assets exceeds national shipbuilding capacity. We are working with our partners in the maritime industry base to address unique challenges in producing a large, complex ship like Polar Security Cutter. In conjunction with the prime contractor, we are nearing the end of a long and complex process to modify the contract, formalize costs and schedule requirements before production activities can begin. The Polar Security Cutter remains one of the Coast Guard's top priority acquisition priorities and retains the attention and focus of Coast Guard and Department of Homeland Security leadership. As we work to advance the acquisition, we are completing service life extension activities on Polar Star and planning major maintenance to address obsolescence and outdated systems on Healy. Additionally, we are moving quickly to acquire a commercially available polar icebreaker as part of our Arctic bridging strategy. While icebreakers are currently in the spotlight, our acquisition portfolio also includes the construction of national security cutters, offshore patrol cutters, and fast response cutters that already or will operate in Alaskan waters, as well as delivery of upgraded C-130 long-range surveillance aircraft, MH-60 Tango helicopters that are well-suited for the distances and challenges that operators face in that region. These efforts complement significant investments in shore infrastructure to support the service's full range of missions, including construction of home port facilities for the polar security cutters at Seattle and a new home port in Juneau for the support of the future operations of the commercially available polar icebreaker. All of these investments are critical to ensuring Coast Guard presence to safeguard America's interests as an Arctic nation, as well as protection of the people, traditions, and resources of Alaska. I appreciate this subcommittee's continued bipartisan support, and I look forward to our continued work together on advancing these critical efforts in the high latitudes. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. MacLeod, you're recognized.
Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Carvajal, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss GAO's recent work on Arctic operations. As an Arctic nation, the United States has substantial interests in the region. Warming temperatures and melting sea ice have opened new shipping routes, and U.S. adversaries have taken note. This includes growing interest by Russia and China as they seek greater access to the region and its resources. This has become even more evident as the United States has monitored Chinese and Russian military vessels conducting joint exercises in Alaska, off of Alaska. My testimony today will focus on two main areas: Coast Guard efforts to assess Arctic risk and challenges the service faces in carrying out its missions in the region. As you know, Coast Guard plays a key role in United States Arctic policy. Our work found that the Coast Guard has done a good job of assessing evolving risks in the region, such as those resulting from increased vessel traffic. These may include greater chances of incidents like oil spills or ships in distress. The Coast Guard has also taken steps to manage risk by deploying cutters and aircraft to the region during times of peak maritime activity. But the Coast Guard has not fully tracked the time and resources spent on its Arctic activities. Complete information on the assets used and the missions conducted in the region would help the Coast Guard better monitor use of its resources and enable it to make more accurate assessments of future needs. In prior hearings, we've discussed Coast Guard recruitment and retention challenges that affect the service's ability to carry out its missions. And workforce shortages continue to be an issue. Our work has found that the Coast Guard asset and infrastructure challenges can negatively impact retention. These issues are particularly acute in the Arctic. Related to assets, reliance on an aging cutter fleet and the need for additional capacity has hindered the service's ability in the activity in the Arctic. The availability of the Coast Guard's two aging icebreakers is also limited, given the substantial maintenance required to keep them operational. As discussed, to address this gap and maintain reliable Arctic operations, the Coast Guard is procuring 3 new heavy polar icebreakers, known as polar security cutters. However, as GAO has previously reported, this program has experienced design challenges that have caused significant delays. In addition to its asset challenges, limited infrastructure further hinders Coast Guard's ability to conduct missions in the Arctic. For example, the Coast Guard operates its forward deployed helicopters from a leased aircraft hangar in Alaska because it lacks its own infrastructure. In 2019, GAO reported that almost half of the Coast Guard's shore infrastructure was beyond its service life, resulting in costly project backlogs. At that time, the backlogs totaled at least $2.6 billion. Our updated preliminary analysis shows that this total is likely now close to $7 billion. This is particularly concerning in the Arctic because there's limited infrastructure to begin with. Further, given competing demands of managing the growing backlog while replacing its aging assets, the Coast Guard will likely face challenges carrying out its Arctic missions, including assisting efforts to counter Russia and China's activities in the region. In closing, the Coast Guard has a critical role in protecting U.S. interests in the Arctic. It faces growing responsibilities to manage risk to maritime security and national security. Conditions in the region continue to change. GAO has made recommendations that could help the Coast Guard improve its planning, acquisition, and data collection efforts. Implementing our recommendations will help the Coast Guard to better manage its Arctic-related resource needs and ensure the service is able to meet its growing responsibilities in the region. Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carvajal, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, all three of you. Now we turn to questions from the panel. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Admiral Gautier, Russia has 55 icebreakers, and China, which is not even an Arctic nation, has 4 and more on the way. For a foreseeable future, we have 2, and hopefully a third if the Coast Guard can find or acquire a commercially available icebreaker. How do you mismatch in capabilities impact of the Coast Guard's Arctic operations, and how can the service effectively project sovereignty and protect our nation's vast resources in the Arctic when confronting increasing aggressive behavior by China and Russia?
Chairman, our ability as United States Coast Guard and as a nation to do the things that you described, to project our sovereignty and assure our interests are met, we like to say that presence equals influence. You have to be there physically in order to assure our own sovereignty. That requires, for the United States, a surface presence, which means icebreakers in terms of getting access to ice-covered, ice-filled waters. Now, with regards to the difference that you described, Russia having 55 icebreakers, PRC having 2 medium and now 2 recently constructed light icebreakers, we're concerned about the growing gap between the United States Coast Guard's icebreaking capability and our competitors' capability, especially as we see them operating more often and more often together in Arctic waters. This is why it's so important to have your enduring support for icebreaker growth and what we've described in our fleet mix analysis to having 8 to 9 Coast Guard heavy and medium icebreakers as a mix, so we can be present to shape the international rules-based order, to check our adversaries when they do wrong, and to make sure that our national interests are met.
Thank you for your answer. I'm hoping that there's also coming with that 9 necessary vessels, some sort of timeline. We'd really appreciate it. Admiral Thomas, as I mentioned in my opening statement, this subcommittee was told nearly a year ago that we would soon reserve a plan to procure the service's much-needed fleet in PSCs. To date, we have yet to see such plan, let alone a cost estimate or timeline or first vessel in the fleet. On September the 26th, the committee sent a bipartisan letter asking that by November 15th, service be provided the committee with a determination on reaching sufficient design maturity to allow for a decision to proceed to full production, whether the prototype models of hull can be used in construction, and the cost estimate for the first PSC, timeline for construction, and whether the funds appropriated to date for the PSC will be a sufficient number to cover the cost of the first PSC. These are all items which service has said it will provide by the end of the year. Unfortunately, the response we've received ahead of this hearing did not provide any meaningful answers to our questions. Actual metrics and data. Are you able to share today to assure us that PSC program is moving forward? When will you be able to communicate and update the timeline and the cost estimate?
Sir, thank you for the question. I think in June, we came and saw this committee. We said by the end of this calendar year, we would be back to say we are moving forward with a production decision through DHS. I am still confident that that is where we head. Right now, we had a final critical design review at September 23rd when we got there. Bollinger Marine Shipyard is doing incredible things to raise the percentage of completion of our design. We are over 80%, and that was as of September 3rd. I think we're going to have our procurement readiness review in November, and we're going to see that we're even further. We're continuing to negotiate with them on cost. We are continuing to work with them for the production readiness review with our prototype fabrication assets that are really providing the baseline and the foundation of the Polar Security Cutter. What I think is, sir, we are going to seek from DHS in mid-December a approval for a production decision, and we will have that by the end of this calendar year.
Okay, well, we're counting on it. Time has expired, so let's see. Mr. Larson, you're recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral Allan, where's the planning, funding, and construction of Base Seattle project currently stand? And how is Coast Guard continuing to engage the relevant stakeholders there?
Sir, thank you for that question. Seattle is going to be a very important launching point for our Polar Security Cutters to do the missions we need within the Arctic and Antarctic. Right now, we were able to receive $100 million in 2024. We are completing our environmental impact statement for how we would put those Polar Security Cutters in at the base there in Seattle, working with the ports of Tacoma and ports of Seattle. That will be out in the Federal Register this Saturday. In addition, we are working to put out a record of decision and then looking at the $180 million that we think we need in fiscal year 25 to keep this project going. It's going to be expensive to bring these new cutters into a very compact area and put them where they need to be with the infrastructure support that they need to make sure that they're ready to go, as we talked about, with 8 to 9 of them over time and continued presence up in the Arctic and Antarctic.
Is this a DEIS on Saturday?
Yes, sir, the PEIS, yes, sir.
The draft, okay. And then how are you engaging with the stakeholders there?
So, sir, we've been up there a couple times. I'm going to be there again next Thursday to talk to them. Now that our Federal Register announcement will be out, they'll be able to see what our alternatives are, and the one that we have selected as the best for the Coast Guard. But we know that this is a negotiation, and we know this is a partnership. So we're going to be working closely with them to figure out the best way forward, not only for the Coast Guard, not only for the nation, but the Port of Seattle and the Port of Tacoma.
Mr. MacLeod, which of the GAO's open recommendations for the Coast Guard's icebreaker programs are the highest priority, both in respect to the urgency and the potential for benefit?
GAO's multiple recommendations regarding the Polar Security Cutter are very important, especially at this time. Key to one of our recommendations would be that this design stability is reached before construction of the Polar Security Cutters to avoid future cost increases.
How has the Coast Guard and the Navy partnership worked? The whole idea of having the Navy be part of this was to bring the Navy's experience into the design, the development, but it doesn't seem to have worked as planned.
GAO has reported that, the partnership between the Navy and the Coast Guard has worked well for these procurements. I think that there's a range of reasons for the delays, from contractor to Coast Guard acquisition and experience. But the partnership itself seems to be working well and has benefited the Coast Guard.
Admiral Allan, how's the Coast Guard planning to address the remaining open recommendations, which are double-digit?
So, sir, I think when you look at the recommendations that they're making, it's always good to have someone looking over your shoulder correcting your work, and I think they're providing us a lot of goodness as far as that goes. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that we are incorporating as many of those recommendations in the way forward, because I think they have the same goals we do. Do we have schedule right, and do we have cost right? And the more we can do up front, that'll allow us to stop going over budget or over a time schedule. So we're looking at each one of those. I think we're trading off and on what those percentages are. I don't think we'll be at 100% when we finally get to full design, but I think when you look at where we're at and how we're going and how we're building these polar security cutters, we will have substantially complied with the recommendations that GAO is making.
Well, it was noted earlier that the last one was built before John Rayfield joined this committee, and I'd like to get the next one built before he leaves the committee.
Sir, we are barreling ahead to make sure that he sees one of these.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Larson. Mr. Babin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses. Appreciate you being here. As the sea ice in the Arctic recedes, Arctic routes remain open for longer periods of time. We're all reading about that. They're staying open each year longer. This has resulted in a drastic increase in military and civilian maritime traffic. Just last month, China's Coast Guard claimed to transit the Arctic Sea for the first time, and both Russia and China have announced their intentions to take advantage of the new shipping routes. Over the long term, how does the Coast Guard plan to meet the threats of our adversaries and protect freedom of movement in the Arctic? And this is for you, Admiral Gautier.
Congressman, in a couple of different ways. First is through resource growth, and we actually have made tremendous progress in doing things like recapitalizing our C-130 fleet from an older C-130H to a C-130J in Kodiak, by shifting our helicopter fleet from a mixed H-60 and H-65 fleet into an all H-60 fleet out of Kodiak. It's by home porting additional fast response cutters. It's by bringing this commercially available icebreaker into play. In terms of that, we have a long way to go, and I think that's a theme of this particular hearing in terms of the growth necessary in terms of polar security cutters. But sir, we also need to operate differently, and that's why we're investing more in forward operating locations where we put our helicopters and our Coast Guard members closer to the area of operations where the fishermen are moving and where our competitors are operating.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And also, for whoever can answer this, if Admiral Allan or anyone else, Ms. MacLeod, you too, we've been following the icebreaker collaboration effort, or ICE Pact, between the United States, Canada, and Finland. And I understand just yesterday, our nation signed a new memorandum of understanding on icebreakers. In yesterday's press release, I saw the memorandum of understanding included, and I quote, the exchange of knowledge, information, and resources in each of our countries. Given the timeliness of this hearing, I'd like to give you just a minute to discuss what you see in terms of the expectations of this committee and Congress at large to support this new initiative. If you could specifically dive into the word resources piece here and what you expect Congress to be involved with, I would sure be very appreciative. Admiral?
Yeah, in keeping with the nature of your question, we're pretty excited about the promise of ICE Pact. As you mentioned, it was signed yesterday. Secretary Mayorkas was the signatory on behalf of the United States. This is a launching pad for a tremendous amount of possibility. With the collaboration of the U.S. and two of our allies, we really think that there's a lot of promise in terms of the sharing of research and development, information technologies, workforce knowledge, and so on, that it'll better enable us to collectively build more and more capable icebreakers at better costs moving into the future. We've just begun to form a number of work groups. The Coast Guard's in charge of 2 of them, so we'll all have to stay tuned on the progress made and how we can collaborate with Congress to make this a success.
Thank you. I still have some time left, so I wanted to ask another question. The Coast Guard and Navy are planning to invest more than $11.8 billion to build and maintain 3 polar security cutter heavy icebreakers. The first ship was scheduled for delivery this year, but at this point, we're hoping to get it before the end of the decade, lamentably. Given the importance of Arctic operations, what is being done to prevent operational gaps?
So, sir, I'll just say, reiterate, we are looking forward to making an announcement to Congress by the end of this year that we are moving forward with production on that Polar Security Cutter. But as you say, we've got to deliver that in 2030. One of the good news stories, I think, and through the help of this committee and others, the commercially available polar icebreaker, we are also going to say that we're going to have that in the Coast Guard inventory by the end of this fiscal year. If you were to take a look at it today, it's painted about a quarter of the way Coast Guard icebreaker red. It's underway today with a team from the owners and ABS doing an evaluation, and in the future weeks, we're going to be able to get on that vessel and be able to understand how we can operate that within the Arctic. And it's a proven vessel that's operated in the Antarctic and the Arctic. We'll need that $25 million in fiscal year 25 to crew and provision that vessel, but I think we're looking to close those gaps through some of our acquisition programs.
Excellent. Thank you, Admiral, very much. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Representative Carbajal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral Allan, the Coast Guard icebreaking requires coasties to operate the cutters. You are currently operating at 10%, down 10% of your workforce. Are you confident that you will have the requisite personnel to operate and maintain the PSCs while conducting other missions?
Sir, thank you for that question. One of the things I'd like to say is that we are making great advancements on bringing crews into the Coast Guard. Last year, in fiscal year 24, that was our best year for bringing people into the Coast Guard since 2007, and that's across active duty, reserve, and our enlisted workforce. We have all of our companies that are going into Cape May full up through March. So we are starting to close that gap, but we've got a long way to go, especially with the growth that we have. So we are going to continue to work with this committee and work with others to understand where our highest priority needs are, how we're moving people to those areas, and making sure that we are continuing to bring in recruits at the highest numbers we can based upon our support infrastructure to meet that need.
Moreover, do we have the infrastructure available to house and support these members assigned to these assets, whether in Seattle or Alaska?
Sir, thank you for that question. I think when the Commandant was here in front of you, she told you that the Coast Guard needs to be a $20 billion organization by 2033, and that we need to have a $3 billion PC&I budget immediately, growing to $4 billion by 2033. I would tell you that as we make trade-offs within our own budget, a lot of times we are trading offshore infrastructure. We are trying to bring in the capabilities, the OPCs, the PSCs, 60s and C-130s, and we are relying on Congress's help through the unfunded priority list to help us with that shore infrastructure. So no, I don't think we have that in there right now, and I think that that's important to our people. I just was a district commander in a recent job, and I would go out to our stations that are falling apart and watch as we're losing crew members to the local fire department, the local police department that have just upgraded their facilities and assets that they're using.
Thank you. Ms. MacLeod, while we have discussed several factors that have delayed the Polar Security Cutter program, we cannot ignore that this is the first attempt to construct a heavy icebreaker on U.S. soil in over 50 years. Undoubtedly, our underdeveloped shipbuilding industry has also challenged the Coast Guard's efforts. How can Congress continue to invest in our domestic shipbuilding industry so that it can best support the Coast Guard's icebreaker programs, and how's that partnership with the Navy going?
Sir, I think as you look at that partnership, we need that partnership, but more importantly, we need that national industrial base to increase in size. It needs to be not an investment on individual ships, but an investment on how we're doing that across the nation.
Thank you, Admiral Allan, but that question was directed to Ms. MacLeod. I apologize if I...
For sure, there's been a lack of U.S. shipbuilding experience that has definitely contributed to the issues that we're discussing today. It's something that we continue to look at, the types of experience that can be leveraged here in the United States going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I have a little bit more time. Admiral Allan, back to you. Budgetary decisions associated with the procurement of icebreakers cannot be made in a vacuum. The maintenance backlog of your shoreside infrastructure is growing at an alarming rate, affecting the housing, workstations, docks, and shoreside facilities needed to home port PSCs. What will happen if Congress and the Coast Guard do not address the shoreside infrastructure backlog?
Sir, thank you for that question. When you look at the Coast Guard's shore infrastructure, we're a $24 billion organization. We should be investing $500 million to $1 billion in that infrastructure every year to make sure that it's maintained at a modern standards to support our people. Without it, we watch people making decisions because they're living in facilities that they aren't proud of or can't do their mission. We're watching as we're putting more and more of our maintenance dollars into facilities that are failing that should have been replaced long ago. So I think it's a very important part for us not only to look at the assets that we're bringing on, but the shore infrastructure to make sure that it is in line with the expectations that people would have where they want their sons and daughters serving.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, and Mr. Rizal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here again. And Admiral Allen, it's good to see you again. Appreciate all of you very much. As we focus on the Coast Guard's icebreaker recapitalization efforts and their abilities to meet the needs, I want to place an important emphasis on our adversaries, Russia and China, and the threat that they pose. I'm proud of what Bollinger Shipyards has stepped up to the plate to help service and meet its goals and combat our adversaries. Bollinger's commitment to building the first U.S.-made heavy icebreaker in over 50 years underscores their dedication to national security and creating jobs here at home. When Bollinger acquired V.T. Halter, the latter had amassed $250 million in losses on the PSC program. Fast forward to today, Bollinger has invested over $100 million in Mississippi, and the returns have been almost immediate. Bollinger has also expanded its Mississippi workforce by nearly 50%. Its new construction workforce in Mississippi alone has more than doubled. Future success will require strong coordination, flexibility, and a willingness to solve problems as they arise. Effective and realistic planning, budgeting, and funding allocations are going to be critical for the success of shipbuilding programs. Endless studies by the government fail to produce realistic assessments which diminish competition among American shipyards. Admiral Gautier, as we say it in Mississippi, I want to discuss some of these funding, these efforts. We know that there's a shortfall in funding. Uncertainty of surrounding award methods have led to reallocating funds from other programs from fiscal year to fiscal year. This cycle further destabilizes the domestic maritime industry. Why did the Coast Guard not request funding for the PSC program for 2025?
Congressman, if it's all right, it's probably better for Admiral Allen to answer that question.
So, sir, I think the reason we didn't request in 2025 is we are looking to get ahead of the curve. Right now, we have the money we need based upon the progress we make. However, to your point, we've seen a lot of that progress made in just a short period because Bollinger Mississippi Shipyard has been involved, has been engaged, and they're bringing in the right people to make this thing not just an idea, but a way forward. So we are looking forward to doing that. I think we will be requesting additional money for our ship, but I think that will come as we finalize arrangements and negotiate the final cost.
Very good. Going back to the activity of our adversaries, I was encouraged that on the very first page of your testimony, you addressed the increased presence of the PRC in Russia, including unilateral and combined military and Coast Guard activities we're seeing now in the U.S. Arctic. Can you please expand a little bit on how the Coast Guard's Arctic strategy and implementation addresses these concerns?
Congressman, first off, the increased presence that we're seeing from PRC forces, both Navy and Coast Guard, is not a surprise because they've actually told us they intended on doing that through their Arctic strategy in terms of having an increased presence up there. So not a surprise to us. Our key element here is to meet presence with presence to assure our national sovereignty. Usually they're there seasonally in the summertime, and although it's been going later into the fall. So we've been mobilizing some additional national security cutter time to operate in and along the maritime boundary line and in the Aleutians to make sure that in conjunction with the Department of Defense, because they also share a presence and a responsibility there, that we are there when our competitors are in or near our exclusive economic zones. We also overfly as well with our Coast Guard aircraft out of Kodiak.
Very good. What would you say to those who raise concerns that the plan does not include key metrics such as performance measures or timeframes for action items? Are these tracked anywhere?
Yeah, we support the findings in that regard that GAO put in their report, and we're taking steps to address that. I'll just say that and some of these elements are enduring, and many of them are dependent on factors outside of the Coast Guard's purview in terms of, say, budgeting certainty and so on. But in large part, we are making substantial progress across those lines of effort that we've put into our implementation plan for the strategy.
Thank you, and I appreciate all of your hard work. We have total confidence in the United States Coast Guard, and as long as I'm sitting here, we're going to continue to support you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is tiresome. We've gone round and round on this for more than a decade, and we still are looking at another half a decade at the best to get a heavy icebreaker. The GAO report unfortunately doesn't get into the details of why we are so far behind and into the intricacies of the Bollinger's successes and failures. We need to know that. The other, I think, Admiral Gautier, you said something, it sounded like budget. I think you used that word. That's money and the appropriation. The bottom line here, I'm going to ask you guys, is there a national security threat in the Arctic as a result of the inability of the United States to have a presence in the Arctic?
Congressman, we have not failed as a United States Coast Guard year in and year out to have assured presence with our Coast Guard assets. Cannot guarantee that moving forward as adversaries' presence increases, as the conditions of our current two icebreakers age, and until we get recapitalized new cutters in the theater.
So this year, or this last summer, your answer is it was not a threat to our national security. You're able to have the necessary presence. Did I hear you say that next year there may be a national security threat for lack of an operable icebreaking capacity in the Arctic?
Congressman, I acknowledge we have a national security threat now from increased presence of competitors and working together in ways that we have not seen yet. The challenge is how do we ameliorate that threat through Coast Guard and U.S.
How do we mitigate that threat?
I'm sorry?
How do we mitigate that threat?
By being present with our assets.
Can we be present given the present icebreakers that we have?
I'm sorry,
Can we be present given the icebreakers that we currently have?
we have been, and we can continue, but we are at risk without recapitalizing these icebreakers to be present.
to recapitalize? Have you given this committee the specific number of vessels or icebreakers that we need and when we need them?
The Coast Guard believes that we need 8 to 9 icebreakers
When do you need them?
as soon as possible.
That's not an answer. When do you need them? Tomorrow? Next year? When do you need them?
We have a sense of
Listen,
urgency.
what I'm trying to do is to put on the record here that we got one very serious national security problem. Don't dance around. The fact of the matter is we will not have a presence in the Arctic. We know where the Polar Star is. Eventually, you're not going to be able to cannibalize other icebreakers to maintain the Polar Star. The bottom line here is there is a national security threat of great significance as a result of the inability of the Coast Guard to have adequate presence in the Arctic. Do you agree or disagree with me?
I agree.
Very good. Now, what does it take? 8 to 10 icebreakers, of which 3 are heavy icebreakers, which will probably be able to be delivered sometime around 2040. Is that correct?
It's going to take a long time to produce
A long
that
time,
number.
a decade, minimum of a decade for the first one. And then who knows for the next 2 and third one. Bottom line here, and this is really for us, we have continually underfunded the Coast Guard icebreaker program. Continually. And unfortunately, the Coast Guard has not sounded the red alarm and laid down, give us the money or we cannot do it. So we're going to have to come forward here with the money necessary to do it. The question is, can it be built in the United States in a timely manner? There's plenty of indication the answer is, we ain't doing very well now. So we're going to have to rethink this. We're going to have to rethink it. If you need 8 to 10 now, next year, year after next, the only way we're going to do it is to rethink how we're going to get those icebreakers. Made in America? Nobody's been stronger on that than I have over these years. But we're failing. Our industrial base has failed us. And frankly, the Coast Guard has failed us by not sounding an alarm loud. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. Mr. DeBean? So, Mr. Andrew, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Okay, I didn't hear you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. Let me start by saying I want to associate myself with the remarks that Mr. Garamundi made. I think he's on target and he's on point, and I want to dig into that a little bit. You know, in most areas, our military is well positioned to protect our homeland and our allies abroad. There does seem to be an alarming gap in the Arctic Circle, and I think you would all agree with that. Quite frankly, I think most Americans would be surprised how big the gap is when you consider that, you know, Russia alone has 55, am I correct? 55 cutters, and we have at most 2, correct? That's unbelievable, just that statistic alone. So we got to do everything in our power to ensure the necessary provisions are in place so we can bridge the gap in the Arctic and continue to protect our people and our allies. And I, want to say, and I think we all know that I'm more than willing to work across the aisle. I'm more than willing to work with everybody on this. I think we all are. It is dire. The main competition that we have is Russia and China. This is serious stuff. Russia, like I said, has 55, and they're going to expand their fleet. China is expanding their fleet. I mean, this is a big deal. It really is. So before I even go on, I want to get something clear in my mind. And Vice Admiral Allan, thank you for being here. I really do appreciate you. I know I ask hard questions. It's not a personal thing. It's really concern. And I respect the work that you all do. I want you to know that. But based on your response to my colleague from Mississippi, does that not mean the Coast Guard has sufficient appropriated money to complete Polar Security Ice Cutter 1? Do you believe that we have enough money to complete it? I think I know the answer.
Sir, we do not have enough to complete the number one. The question is, how much more do we need? And we think by December, we will understand final contract negotiations, what that dollar amount is and what gap exists.
We, again, on a bipartisan way, want to try to fight for that. I mean, you know, it's everything. I mean, I think this is kind of bipartisan, at least with most folks, peace through strength. I mean, we need the strength, and it's scary to me. I don't know that we have the strength there, regardless of all the other things that you're doing. And Vice Admiral Gautier, I did listen to what you said, and I appreciate those things, but we don't have the money, and we've got to start, the way this place works is making the requests, putting in for it, advocating for it, fighting for it, so that you get what you need. Everybody's at the trough, everybody's competing, but this is stuff that crosses all boundaries and is really serious and real important. I'm curious, I wrote some of the questions down I wanted to ask. How did we get here? How did Congressman Garamundi said that this has been going on for a decade. That's longer than I've been here. This is my third term, and I can remember this discussion even now, which is on my 6th year. How did we get here? How did this multiple administrations through time, what went wrong? Something went wrong. We shouldn't have fallen this far behind. Please give me a candid and blunt answer.
Yes, sir. So what I would say is the Coast Guard is a capital-intensive organization in the non-defense side of budget authorities. When you look at that, our percentage of increase every year is much lower than what DOD is, so we fall further and further behind each year. Creates our requirements to almost as a flat line since 2010 to make trade-offs. And a lot of those trade-offs are keeping assets going as opposed to reacquiring what we need. As the Commandant said, we need to be a $20 billion organization with 5% growth. That needs to happen by 2033. Or to your point, sir, we are not going to be able to deliver the Coast Guard that the nation is asking us to have.
As we spoke yesterday about a different subject, and I appreciated your input and candor with that. I mean, with the cost of everything going up, it is of major, major concern with the inflation we have, which is still there. Costs are going up, as you know, exponentially in some cases. I think we need, I'd love to see us turn a page. You tell us what you need. Now, we can't guarantee just on this one subcommittee that we can deliver that, but again, across the aisle, and again, I associate myself with the remarks, Congressman Garamundi, the gentleman from California, made. I want it to sort of stop. I want to turn a new page. I want you to be working with us, that we're advocating hard. If we fail, so be it, but we should know what hill we're fighting on, what we're fighting for, how much we need, what we want to do. We've really got to get focused here. I don't want it to go on for another 10 or 20 or 30 years. I don't want it to go on to where we have a confrontation and literally the greatest country on the face of the earth can't deal with it. This is serious, serious stuff. Ms. MacLeod, can you highlight the strategic advantages that Russia and China have over the United States when it comes to these assets? I know you know your stuff. I know you've done it already, but we just want to hear it again.
Quantity of icebreakers, in short. Assets in the Arctic.
You know how heartbreaking that is for me to hear America, the greatest country on the face of the earth, and let's call it what it is behind. We're behind. We're behind Russia. We're going to be behind China. Maybe we are already. I don't know. And I don't want that to get worse. I don't think any member here wants it to get worse. It's important stuff. I guess I've used up my time. I appreciate your service. I really do. And I'm not blaming you, but I'm blaming the process. We absolutely have to do better on this. I don't want to look back someday. You worry about your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Man, we lead. We're America. We don't want to fall behind. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
Ms. Peltola, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the benefit of being a low-ranking member is that most of the questions have been asked. And I'm really thankful that there have been a couple members here who have really been trying to dig deep on why the Coast Guard is so in the hole. And my reluctance to talk about this is, why would I want to disadvantage the United States even further by putting on the public record our vulnerabilities? But it's also been really frustrating, having known a couple of your enlisted members personally and having visited where they're stationed, the vessels they're on, hearing about how old the helicopters are. It's frustrating because I've been in this committee when Representative Carbajal has been like begging you, the Coast Guard, to give us a list of what you need. I mean, like, we're standing on the tables, jumping up and down, saying, how can we help you? And wanting you to stand up on the tables and jump up and down and shout back how we can help you. I know that there's concern about the Coast Guard being gobbled up into DOD and swallowed up by the Navy, and nobody wants that. I am such a fan of the culture of the Coast Guard and the work that you do and the way that you train people. And as an Alaskan, as the services you provide. And this is a really interesting committee, and given that I probably won't be here after December, it seems like, why would I stick around to ask questions? But since this is about the Arctic, and I'm the one member on this committee from the Arctic, I am curious, how are there 11 icebreakers in Michigan in the Great Lakes, which are not Arctic or polar, and we're going to get one coming up someday soon for Alaska? And how does Alaska get more resources? And one of the things I will say is I'm very hopeful that, since there won't be any tug of war between the parties in any of the chambers or the White House, there should be a concerted effort just to resource up. And I was glad to hear Representative Van Drew talk about his concerns and all the members on the right-hand side, because it's now their time to shine. There's no excuses for saying, well, somebody didn't like somebody on the other side because of personalities or whatever. Now is the time. You know, I had prepared questions about Alaska, but I guess I want you to talk more about what your needs are in a delicate way, so we're not announcing it to all of our adversaries, but tell us how we can help you. Tell us a number. Give us a number to shoot for.
Congresswoman, we do deeply appreciate the support of this subcommittee. You get us, and you've had enduring support for us. Take, for example, what you authorized, $3.5, $3.6 billion in our capital improvement element of the budget. If that could translate to appropriations, that will go a very long way in helping the Coast Guard. How we also transmit our needs is through the unfunded priorities list, through the budget process. And for the fiscal year 25, we have $1.4 billion of things on the unfunded priority lists that are actually quite crucial, just couldn't fit them within our top line in order to keep the Coast Guard operational, and a number of things that are particularly relevant to Alaska. We need help recapitalizing our aviation fleet to move to an all H-60 fleet, so purchasing more H-60s for the United States Coast Guard so we can pull the older 65s out of service. We need more C-130Js. We've recapitalized all those in Alaska, but we still have a ways to go in other parts of the country. We are now decommissioning our medium endurance cutters without replacement. It's very uncomfortable for us when you look at what's going on, in particular, say, in Haiti and in Cuba, and the potential for a mass migration. We need money for the offshore patrol cutters so we can get those in play as we decommission our older cutters. Those needs are replicated in terms of C5I, in terms of the people support, the housing, the child care centers that we need to make sure we get and retain the best people. So the needs are urgent. The unfunded priorities list is a good place to start, and we do appreciate your support.
Okay, General yields back. So, Mr. Graves, you're not a member, but you're recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And all the Coasties here, Admirals, and, excuse me, all the folks behind you, want to thank you for being here and appreciate your service. Admiral, I heard Congressman Van Drew and others talking about the Arctic. Obviously, Congressman Peltola has been a big advocate and supporter in educating the committee and following in the footsteps of Congressman Don Young and advocating for that state. You know, the reason that we purchased Alaska was, largely the geography as well as the natural resources, and the abundance of that state is profound and just critically important. And I think as we've seen in recent trends, the importance of that region strategically grows. And y'all have talked much about access to the Arctic in terms of icebreaking capabilities. And again, heard Congressman Van Drew talking about the disparity in capabilities in the United States in terms of our heavies. And I believe the Healy being the medium, and the awful shape that we've allowed both the Polar Sea and Polar Star to get into without having a replacement. And now we're moving forward on that. We have pushed the Coast Guard now for, probably the entire time I've been here, to do something to acquire better icebreaking capabilities. And of course, one of the solutions whenever the withdrawal of energy production in some areas of the Arctic, the IVIC became available, and the Coast Guard pushed back, and I thought it was a mistake then. And I think that we were right in our position. The Coast Guard believed that if they acquired the IVIC, then they weren't going to be able to get the funds from Congress to build a heavy. I think you can do both, and now we're seeing we absolutely need to do both. So I'm glad that the Coast Guard included the IVIC on the unfunded priorities list. I'm glad that funds were provided. Can you now give an update on the status of that acquisition?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question, and thanks for the push on the commercially available polar icebreaker. We are making tremendous strides in that with the owner. They've already painted about a quarter of it Coast Guard icebreaker red. They've got it in the water today with ABS, and they're taking a look at those systems. And then we're going to be going on board to finalize negotiations and look how we, in the short time, crew that with those commercial operators. So it is going to be, I think, within the Coast Guard inventory before the end of this calendar year, and we will be sailing that up into the Arctic in 2026, the spring to summer of 2026.
And do I recall that that's going to be home ported in Juneau?
Yes, sir. We're looking to home port that in Juneau. Of course, there's a big delta there right now because the pier that it's been provided is an old NOAA pier and needs a lot of maintenance and a lot of work, but we're going to strive to make sure we at least have the presence of that vessel up there.
Great. And Admiral, I appreciate the update. I'm doing this from memory, which means I may be a little bit off, but as I recall, the Coast Guard had identified some mission capability gaps in regard to the vessel. It was designed while providing heavy access. It was designed to provide a little bit different mission. Can you talk a little bit about some of the mission capability work that needs to be done in order to sort of operationalize that vessel?
Sir, thank you for that question. I think that's an important change in how we're doing business with this one, right? Before, we usually go through and develop a long list of requirements and then build to meet all those requirements. This time, we're taking a vessel that's successfully operated in the Arctic, successfully operated in the Antarctic, and we're going to get on board and try to understand what capabilities it has and how we can use those to make some of our needs, not only with presence on presence as we look for sovereignty up in the Alaska area, but also to bring on additional missions where we think we need additional capacity. We're not sure how that is. We know that we need that vessel. I don't think we're looking to make tremendous investments in that vessel going forward. We just need that for presence and to be able to operate.
Great. Thank you very much. Last question, just because I got a little bit of time left. Congressman Van Drew again cited the disparity in icebreaking capabilities between the United States and other Arctic nations, and including other non-Arctic or Arctic wannabe nations. Could you just talk a little bit about the importance of domestic shipbuilding capability and how that helps to capitalize or address the Coast Guard's needs?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. We down in the Gulf region, we've got a bunch of shipyards that are building Coast Guard cutters right now. We've got 2 shipyards that are building OPCs. We still are building NSCs. We're starting to build a WCC, and we got the PSC. What we know is that the need that the nation has from our industrial base is outstripping the capacity that it has. We
Thank
need
you.
help with that.
Thank you. I know I'm out of time. Just one closing comment, Mr. Chairman. Admirals, I want to just really emphasize something. I went round and round with the previous Commandant, won't get into names, about the flaws in the approach on the OPC. And we've all seen we wasted hundreds of millions of dollars in an extraordinary amount of time. I think we're now seeing another lessons learned on icebreaking capabilities. And I don't even want to go back to deep water. I strongly want to urge, as we move forward, look, all of us are huge supporters. You have an extraordinary mission, and you guys are Swiss Army knife of the sea. We say it all the time. I really hope that moving forward, that we apply the lessons learned to both successes and failures, because, as Admiral Gautier noted, we've got to make sure you have the capabilities and the resources that you need to do your complex job. Thank you. Yield back.
Okay, sounds like we're on a second round. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized.
Well, maybe I'll take half of the 5 minutes
Okay,
very,
half.
very quickly. Admiral Gautier, you, in your testimony just a moment ago, really came to what we need. And that is you talked about the unfunded priorities. It is absolutely essential that you give to this committee the obligation to meet the needs of the Coast Guard. I understand the organization you're working in, it's difficult, but you've got to be very, very clear with us. The unfunded requirements, why are they critical? We've talked around here back and forth on this. The Arctic is one. In response to our Alaska rep, you began talking about shoreside issues. You've got to make that clear to us. Don't be shy. Don't be timid. Your needs, the needs of this nation that are carried out by the Coast Guard will not be achieved unless the Coast Guard comes to us with clarity and the argument, give us the money or else we will fail to address the challenges in the South Pacific, the challenges in the Caribbean, the challenges in the Arctic. You've got to do that. I want you to be bold. I want you to take the risk of challenging us. And then the problem is ours. In the 10 years, 14 years I've been wrestling with this, the Coast Guard has never said, if you fail to give us the money for these activities, we cannot do our job. And this national security cannot be achieved. So I'm challenging you. Challenge us. Don't dance. Come very clear. If we do not have the money for the 8 to 10 icebreakers now or next budget year, we will fail to achieve the necessary presence in the Arctic. Similarly with the other parts of the world. And it's time for us to realize that you are carrying out activities for the Department of Defense for which you receive no money. The Persian Gulf. The Houthi missiles are delivered by ship, dhows or whatever. The Navy can't board them, so they call you. Challenge us. Give us the facts, give us the truth, give us the failure if we fail to fund you. That's our problem. I yield back.
Well, 2.5 minutes. It was a great finale.
Sir, got it and support it.
Great. Okay, well, that brings us to an end to this hearing. It concludes the hearing. We thank you for coming, presenting, answering questions. We just want to get ships built. That's all we want to do. Tell us how to do it. We'll get the money for you. Thank you so much. Meeting adjourned.